The histories are written mostly by yangban, and they look down their nose at the hyangni, and yet the average person, the non-aristocratic commoner and slave, would be looking up to the hyangni as hello everyone, this is Mark Peterson again with the Frog Outside the Well Research Center. Today my guest is a very good friend and former student. This is Kirk Larsen.
Hello.
Kirk was a student of mine at BYU years ago, and then he followed me at Harvard for his PhD. Then you taught in Texas for a year or two, and then went to George Washington University in Washington, D.C., where you had tenure, in fact. And then BYU was able to recruit you. Kirk's a specialist in Chinese and Korean history, and wrote a book on treaties and what's the name of the book?
Tradition, Treaties, and Trade.
Traditions, Treaties, and Trade, relationship between China and Korea from 1850 to 1910, is that right? And you're working on a second book?
I am.
When's it coming out?
In a year or so,
Oh,
I hope.
I hope. And what's the title of this one?
I'm toying with many different titles, but it's probably going to be Pirates, Soldiers, Diplomats, and Other Savages.
Diplomats are savages too, huh? Okay, well that's interesting. So Kirk's a specialist in this time frame, so I invited him to come in and help us analyze this document today. The date of it here, and it says it's a petition to the, if you look in the upper first line, it says, this county's border, Yusang. The Yusang is what? The scholarly community, the scholars of this county. And what's this county? Well, it turns out it's a petition. And all of these people, we counted up, how many were there? 61?
61.
And two of them, these two, were people who passed the Jinsa exam. The Jinsa was a secondary exam, not the Munkwa, not the highest level, but we were able to look them up and find out that they both lived in Onyang. So that told us that this is Onyang County. This is the magistrate who signed off on it, and this is his response to the petition. And his response says he likes the petition and he's going to forward it to higher headquarters. Let's talk about it. It does three things. I look at it as a kind of a symbol of democracy in the Joseon dynasty. And when I was a student in the 70s in Korea, we used to joke that Korea in the Joseon period was more democratic than Korea under Pak Jang-hee. But there were certain democratic actions we see in the Joseon dynasty. The most prominent, of course, was the censorate that had limitations on the king. And you would know this much better than I, but generally speaking, we say Korea was much less autocratic than China, because the censorate was much more active in Korea, and the Korean king and his interaction with the aristocracy, he was a weaker king in comparison to the Emperor of China, in comparison to his government. Would you say that's true?
That's generally true. I mean, in China it ebbs and flows as well, but I think in general the Korean monarchs were more limited by both bureaucracy and aristocracy.
And because of this limitation, that it was sort of a check and balance, which is the heart of a democratic action. So we see elements of democracy, and this is a petition on a certain matter that we'll talk. The second thing is, it turns out this document is a document for and in behalf of hyangni. Now, does our average listener know what a hyangni is? Hyangni are often called ajahn. They were the clerk staff at any government agency. They were generally looked down upon by the yangban. They were the people that had interface with the government. They were the people that very often took the bribes. And so very often they were treated badly in history. But the histories are written mostly by yangban, and they look down their nose at the hyangni. And yet the average person, the non-aristocratic commoner and slave, would be looking up to the hyangni as a part of the government. So I want to talk about where the hyangni fall in. And then there's the signatures, these interesting signatures. Those three. So let's analyze the document a little bit. It starts off, it says, in human affairs, there's nothing greater, nothing exceeds the greatness of chung, hyo, and yod. These three things, and that's all there is. This is about chung,
Loyalty.
and hyo,
Filial piety.
We translate filial piety. And yul,
What would you say, Yola?
faithfulness, faithful widows, usually widows. It can be a faithful woman who's not a widow, but to get recognized as a yolyo, a faithful woman, it's usually a widow. In this case, it's a widow. And then it says, and that's the line right here. The first three things are chung, hyo, and yul. Nothing is more important than them. And then it talks about, if we come over to this point right here, it says gun ni, which is another word for hyangni, and then it has a man's name, Chung Su Jing. And his family, we got it here, his family had 5 generations, 8 hyo, go to the top of the page, 8 hyo and ilyo. So that's a lot in one family. So what the petition is about is let's honor this guy and his descendants. And then it goes on and lists each one. The Chung Su Jing was originally from this county, was a Kodi. Kodi means a dead D, who had lived some time ago. And turns out in the family tree, I'll show you in a minute, he was the main ancestor. He must have been born about 1680 or so. Because it turns out the Mushin Rebellion, it lists him as one of the loyalists in the Mushin Rebellion. The Mushin Rebellion was the rumors that Yangzhou had poisoned his older brother, Kyungzhou, to get the throne. It was not a major rebellion, in fact, but it was a rebellion where a couple of people died from leading the rebellion. So this guy, Chung Su Jing, was a loyalist to the government at that point and rewarded for it. And the document says much of the virtue that passed on to his generations came from his loyalty to the king. And then it was passed on. And then it talks about his son. His son is listed as Seguan. Then it talks about his grandson, who is listed as Chi Yup. And then Chi Yup was such a prominent hyoja, filial son, that it says here that the whole county all referred to him as Chung Hyoja, not Chung Chi Hyo, Chung Chi Yup, but Chung Hyoja, the Hyoja. So by the third generation, this family is known as the family of Hyoja. Well, the next generation, sure, don't you know, Yam Shi is also honored as a Hyoja, and it says that he was likened unto Huang Hyang and Yu Zhou, who were famous Hyoja from China, and was even compared to Taeyan and Soyan, who were also 2 famous Hyoja in China. So if you're being compared to the luminaries from China, you know you've got it made.
You've done well.
You've done well. So this third generation received that honor. Then the fourth generation, then to the Hyunsong generation, what's that, great-great-grandson, we have 2, Myung-woo and Shinu. And then the next generation, Myung-woo had a son named In-gyo, and Shinu had a son named Jun-gyo. So these are all we can see on a genealogic chart like this, and I put it here, the English as well as the Korean as well as the Chinese. Here's the 4 generations that come down, and then the 2 sons, and then each of their sons. Total of 8 filial sons. And then there's one more that's mentioned, and that's right here. It says Jin Shi, his wife, Che Sosa, and that's this one here. Who was Jin Shi? Well, he must have been the brother or the cousin of Young Shi, right here. This wife was an exemplary woman because she was widowed young, and she served her dying mother-in-law. And with all of these, the sons, typically, when a father or a mother-in-law or father-in-law are dying, they do the cut the finger and bleed for them, feed them living blood to revive them. And in several of these cases, they do that. So that's what you do to become a hyoja or a yolyo in this time. So that's what this document is about. And then it says, so please, Gunsu, and it uses hapa. You know, gaka is your majesty for king. Hapa is the honorific, your honor for the kunsu. I didn't know that until I read this document. So it says, please, let's honor them by building a filial arch in the entry to the village. And in the old days, any village was worth its salt had a filial arch. Now, the thing that's interesting about this is that this document was written for and behalf of hyangni, which is a little bit unusual. When I mentioned this to a couple of my Korean friends, they said, oh, that's odd. And so this gives us a new window on what the hyangni were like, that they were despised in one sense, but in another sense, here this hyangni is honored. But notice that the wife, the woman, is listed as sosa, not she. It's not the yangban woman, but the commoner woman. Right. So the hyangni were in this interesting sandwich between the true yangban and the commoners. And they were despised by the yangban generally. And most of our histories that talk about hyangni talk about them in negative ways. But in reality, for the commoner and other yangban even, to interact with the government, you had to go through the hyangni. So they appeared as yangban. So I think that we shouldn't look at hyangni as commoners the way a lot of histories do. But I think they should be listed as the lower level yangban. And we know they had government offices. Their clothing must have been superior. And they had chokbo. And it's interesting that the chokbo of a hyangni only shows intermarriage with other hyangni. Yangban did not marry hyangni. Hyangni could not marry yangban. And yet the next lower stages, the commoners and the slaves, they had rampant intermarriage. So they were virtually one class, but this upper class was really two upper classes as we look. That's one thing, the democratic action, let's petition and get this thing. The treatment of a hyangni. And then the third thing I want to look at is the signatures. So I've been doing all the talking.
Two thoughts about hyangni. One is, as you say, they are the face of the government to the locals, not least because county magistrate comes and rotates on a regular basis, but they're the ones that know where the bodies are buried. They know all the skeletons, everyone's closets. That's a lot of local power. Even if the yangban themselves look down on them and say, you're not real elite. But on the other hand, I think of the work of Kyungmoon Hwang about how different social groups start to enjoy more status and more mobility, especially in the 19th and early 20th century.
This is early 19th.
I wonder if this is an early forerunner of that, where you start to see secondary sons and people from the north and jungin, the middle people, that maybe this is another example of perhaps some more social mobility in the late Joseon than we used to think existed.
The signatures are the final thing to talk about. Each one is unique. Now here's the format. You have the three names, the typical three names. No one here was a weja. There's no two-name person. They're all three-character names. And then the fourth character you see in each of these lines is the highly stylized signature. And the point I want to make here is, when I first went to Korea, I was told I had to get a dojang. You don't sign, you have to use a dojang. These days, foreigners get one just for the fun of it. That was your case, right?
Right.
But I needed it for real functioning. And I was told that that's what Koreans did traditionally. Well, it turns out, if you look at Joseon Dynasty documents, it's all this. Buying and selling of things, inheriting things, you would sign. You didn't use a dojang. The dojang, here's a dojang, was used by the government official. And here's a great example of 61 signatures petitioning for this action. And the dojang, it turns out, is a 20th century read Japanese innovation in Korea. It's not really Korean. The true Korean is the signature. So those are the points I'd like to make about this. Any other input on this?
I think these signatures are fascinating, not least because you have at least one example of what looks like Hangul.
Yeah, it does. It looks like two H's together, doesn't it? But ideally, they are all individualized and unforgeable, because no one else could write your signature the way you do. So the way our signatures are.
Right.
Yeah. That's what this is about, and I hope you enjoyed it. A window on democracy and social status and signatures of the Joseon Dynasty. I'm going to have Kirk come back another time and talk about the USS General Sherman. He gave a presentation on this recently. It was really fascinating. And next time we film, I think we're going to have you come in again.
Love it.
Okay, great. Hey, thanks so much. See you next time. Bye.